Good morning. Please take a seat. We are going to get started with our keynote presenter today. We're so excited to see so many of you here. And I just have a quick question. Can somebody come help me with the slides? Where did our tech guy go? Oh, there it is. They did it. Woo! Okay, here we go. Okay. Welcome. I always tell everyone that the MELED conference is better than any family reunion I ever go to, and I love my family. So it's so wonderful to see you here today. I have the honor to introduce someone truly inspiring today, Susana Ibarra-Johnson. We are honored to have her with us because her life and work remind us of the power of education, connection, and celebrating who we are. I had the opportunity to chat with Susana and ask her more about her life and what led her to education. So, of course, the first important question I asked was, have you ever been to Minnesota? She said yes, but I was surprised when she told me about her Minnesota experience because it was something I have never experienced as a lifelong Minnesotan. As the daughter of migrant parents, she experienced a lot of disrupted schooling in 1st through 11th grades as work required her family to move to different states with agricultural seasons. So she first visited Minnesota as a child while her family worked on sugar beet farms in the summer. And for those of you who work with migrant students, she assured me it was a good experience and they attended summer programming while their parents worked. Susana's family emphasized the importance of education. Her dad would tell her, "You don't want to do this type of work. You need an education." Those words stuck with her and became a guiding light for everything she's done since. Susana told me about a teacher who inspired her. This teacher loved the Beatles and played their songs for the class. She told the students about how much the songs meant to her and then invited students to bring in their own cultural music and explain why it was important to them. It turned into an exchange of stories and songs that brought the whole class together. That experience stayed with Susana, and it's such a great reminder for all of us. Even if a teacher doesn't speak the same language as their students, they can still create a space where students feel comfortable sharing who they are. It's about connection, curiosity, and lifting up the things students value, like their native languages and cultural traditions. Susana carried that lesson with her as she pursued education and later began her research. She visited bilingual classrooms and saw something that felt so familiar, students moving effortlessly between Spanish and English. To her, it wasn't a problem, it was a strength. She saw how those students use both languages and tools to connect, learn, and express themselves. At the time, though, the approach in many schools was different. Teachers were encouraged to separate languages, English for this time, Spanish at this time. It didn't sit right with Susana. She believed there had to be a better way, one that built on students' strengths instead of limiting them. That's when she discovered translanguaging. It's a term that describes what Susana has seen and lived her whole life, the ability to use multiple languages fluidly to communicate, learn, and thrive. Now, Susana is one of the leading voices in this field. She inspires educators everywhere to rethink how we see multilingual students, not as people who need to catch up, but as students who already bring so much to the classroom. Her work encourages us to celebrate their native languages and cultures and to create learning environments where every student feels valued. I can't wait for you to hear from Susana today. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome as she shares her incredible journey and her passion for translanguaging.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Buenos dias. Good morning. I come from the land of enchantment, New Mexico, Nuevo Mexico. So I'm so glad to be here. And as Christina just said, as a migrant farm worker, we traveled a lot to different states, and one of them was Minnesota. Now, I called my dad to ask him where, because we only came 1 year, and I was like, I wonder what the name of it was, because we were helping another family finish their harvest, and so we came just for the day and then went back to Montana and traveled to the other where we were originally supposed to be working. So I'll ask him, but he didn't answer his phone, which is kind of rare, so he must be busy. But I'm so glad to be here today and talking to you about translanguaging pedagogy. I've been involved in translanguaging for my dissertation work. That's really, I joke with Ophelia, that's how I found her, because as I was analyzing some of my data, I saw that students were going beyond code switching or even using Spanglish, English and Spanish combined together. It was more than that, and so in 2009, I read her the 21st Century of Bilingual Education that just changed my world. And like I say, I think translanguaging came to me because as a person that lived on the border of Eagle Pass, Texas, and Piedras Negras, Coahuila, where my parents were born and raised, but we crossed the border to, or really I should say the border crossed us because my grandparents were there for a while in Eagle Pass, former Mexico. So at any rate, we were there, and I just, that's how we communicated. And I know a lot of you communicate in a way where your home language practices are definitely very vibrant, very dynamic, the radio stations and so forth. So I think that it's great that we are able now to talk about what translanguaging is, but also to leverage it for learning. So today I'm going to share with you, this is a brief, just what I'll speak to you today regarding the context. So for me, context is very important for bi-multilingualism and that long-standing norm that we have here in the United States, even though seemingly we think we don't have it. And then moving to translanguaging, a shift in perspective, and moving to the pedagogy. And then lastly, I will share some examples from the translanguaging classroom book that I co-authored with Ophelia Garcia and Kate Seltzer. And then just finishing with some action steps that hopefully you all can take up, and hopefully some time for some Q&A today. So I'll get started. So for me, we have to problematize the problem that we have here. So oftentimes, I think we can all agree that knowing and using more than one language is definitely an asset. It's not a deficit, it's an asset. But there are different deficit-oriented narratives that are out there in our schools. And so sometimes we label our students that are labeled English language learners. We refer to them in our book as emergent bilinguals. They're rising in numbers and are framed often as a problem in our classrooms. And that has it's a serious problem for me because that sometimes, well, not sometimes, in our schools, we may use remedial courses. We may think that, of course, let's transition them to English so that they can learn English type of solutions that we have in our classroom. And that belief that lies beneath the focus on rising numbers is more, the emergent bilinguals are a problem and has to be solved in U.S. schools. And while I agree that all teachers must be equipped with scaffold and differentiating, I know in my years in the WIDA consortium, we did a lot of work with our English language development standards and even helped develop the Spanish language development standards. I offered this morning to reframe that bi-multilingualism is always and has been the norm here in the United States, that there is and always has been linguistic expertise and cultural wealth wherever there are emergent bilinguals, and that teachers have the exciting opportunity to learn about the leverage the students' language and ways of knowing in the classroom. So I hope you join me in that journey today. So we have here, I have here some statistics that you see up here that point out the longstanding norm of bi-multilingualism in the United States across the world. And so you can see here, over 7,000 languages in the world, more than 350 languages spoken in the United States, according to the U.S. Census. 1 in 5 U.S. residents speaks a language other than English at home. Speakers of Spanish, Mandarin, and Tagalog are 70% of speakers of language other than English in the United States. And many language other than English speakers also speak English, right, according to the migrant policy that you see there. And yet, the normative approaches for language and literacy education in the U.S. have had and continue to have a singular goal, and that is the focus on English. But we will definitely change that. So here we have, more so, like where I'm coming from, New Mexico, we have pueblos, tribes, and nations. And so we often think about language diversity as something that's, and as well as in Minnesota, I'm sure, that's imposed from elsewhere. Typically through immigration, right, we always think that our students that are coming in are coming with a language other than English, but we have such historical, already languages that were here in the United States. So as a field and as a teacher, educator, we have to continue to historize what you see here. The United States as a multilingual place. The U.S. has always been a polyglot nation containing hundreds of indigenous languages, similar to what you see there in the slide. So this harmful normative approaches to English also root in historical racist framings of the language practices of indigenous, African American, Mexican American, Puerto Rican communities, and all other communities as well that are here in our United States. I want to definitely focus on debunk the deficit view and look at the assets that our students are bringing here and continue to, these harmful perceptions that we have of our language minoritized children and children of color. So we need to move from that to continue to contextualize. I have another slide. So as you can see here, that despite the longstanding multilingual norm in the United States, monolingualism, monoculturalism ideologies undergirded past settler colonial and racist policies still pervade the United States on literacy and language in schools and communities. For example, I know some of you might have studied the westward expansion that focused on that and how that happened. And also, for example, families continue to be verbally and physically assaulted for speaking Spanish in parks and public spaces. Asian Americans, I know, are fearful of leaving their homes, going to church, or speaking, especially during the pandemic and also post-pandemic as well. So language and literacy policies and pedagogies anchored in these racist understandings that uphold English monolingualism as a historical norm in the United States have been responsible for the failure and push out of many racialized multilingual students across the United States. So this reality has led scholars, both here and around the world, to disrupt dominant understandings of monolingualism that shape our K-12 school systems. And that actually shape our culture and instead foreground students' fluid multilingualism and this historical norm that we've had. So one way that scholars have done so is through new critical social linguistic perspectives of multilingualism. And so I'm going to talk to you about these perspectives, which is translanguaging, has been my scholarly work for probably the past 10 years that I work. I do a lot of action-oriented type of research with my teachers, pre-service and in service. So I'm going to start by talking about two views. And this work comes from Ofelia Garcia, Ricardo Otogay, and we also have Wallace Reed that talk about the outsider perspective and the insider perspective. So the outsider is one that takes what they are called the name languages. So in the examples that you'll see, the work that I do is with English and Spanish. So their name languages as starting point when thinking about languages. The other one is the insider perspective, okay? So there's the external and outside perspective. And that it takes speakers and their languaging that they're doing, whether in a small group, in a community, which doesn't always align with the expectations of name standard language norms. As the starting point for thinking about language and for thinking about educating language minoritized students. And to explain two perspectives, I have a short video that you will see, and it features third grade students that are doing an observation chart. If you're familiar with the guided language acquisition design, what it is, it's they put pictures and they'll describe it, label it, and they usually almost always have heterogeneous group linguistically and culturally and academically so that they can talk about what they see and write about it and have these rich exchanges with each other. So I will share that with you right now.
¿Cómo se escribe? Okay, what do you guys see?
Yo veo agua.
It's already there. I see it. It's already here. Oh, guys, this is caused by. All right, let's look at this picture. I think this is caused by lots of rain flattening the land. Escribe Dominga que mucha lluvia lo hizo esto. How do you say flat in español? Flat? Flat in español.
¿Cómo se llama?
¿Negro?
No, ¿qué es esto? ¿Qué es esto? Como...
No, esto.
Wait.
Esto.
Flap. Wait.
Que yo creo que esto es plano porque la lluvia lo hace plano.
Pon la lluvia la hace plano.
Acá, era. Ajá, así.
Tell her how to spell it.
Okay. Mira, vaya. ¿Cómo se escribe?
They were adorable. So you can see there the external perspective of the students' languaging. You can see in that small group that the external perspective, of course, it may seem like it's unbalanced, like, oh, they don't know what they're saying. They're using some sign language. They're using total physical response, trying to figure out, ¿qué es esto? ¿Qué es esto? And also the young girl was, said negro, she's also acquiring English. So you can see that external perspective that seemingly that you can see that, oh, maybe they're code switching, or maybe, oh, they're these non-English proficient students, non-Spanish proficient students. But in reality, they're trying to make meaning, and purposefully the teacher would create these translanguaging spaces so that they can come together and negotiate meaning together. And at the end, I'm sure the teacher was filming and she said, oh, es plano, and they cut it, which I wish they wouldn't have, so we could have seen that. And they took it up right there and then. He just said plano and was able, which means flat, right? And so I think that external perspective, we can see it perhaps as incomplete or unbalanced, as you see there. However, the internal perspective would instead view students' way of languaging as a communicative norm of their bilingual home and community. So in this view, the students language the way that we all language, by leveraging all our resources. They were trying to make meaning and figure out just one of the vocabulary words that they had that they couldn't grasp it quite a bit, but at the end they were able to do it. And then also in the external the internal perspective, the ideologies about native speakers and standard language, this normative way of languaging is marked as different and even deficient for Latinx children in the example that we have there. An internal translanguage perspective recognizes and embraces the student's way of languaging and invites a version of schooling that leverages their existing linguistic gifts that they have, and they are linguistic geniuses, as you saw, as they were trying to figure out a specific term, but more importantly, the communication that they were doing together. So what is translanguaging? This definition comes from the work that, again, been doing with Ofelia Garcia and Kate Seltzer. So it refers there, as it says there, is the everyday language practices and ways of communicating among bilingual learners. So myself growing up in the borderlands and also very geographically in different borderlands as a migrant, I would hear, different languages, of course, English, but then also depending who was working with us, if they were Filipino or different languages, we would definitely hear that. And so it was for me, I was always interested in languages and being able to learn about it and so forth. My parents also worked in the canneries in Del Monte in San Jose, California, so that was definitely where I got exposed with other languages in school that we went there. So again, we have very specific communicative ways of doing language, so that's very important. And so you can also leverage that to approach to teaching, and again, to leverage the students' full linguistic repertoire. It is not something, we all do it as bi-multilinguals, but it often stays at home and also seen as a deficit, as I contextualized it earlier. But we also need to have that bridge. It needs to come from home to school and school to home. So it has to be bi-directional. It can't be just like, okay, you leave that at home because that's how that type of languaging needs to stay at home, and it shouldn't be that way. So I think that's why translanguaging is for me, very important as I do research with my pre-service and in-service teachers. So in the book of the Translanguaging Classroom, You can see here that we also talk about a metaphor, the image of a corriente. You can see there the corriente, a current, a river or other body of water. And this corriente refers to the diverse, fluid language practices that flow through the classroom, even though when it seems invisible. Oftentimes, I like to give the metaphor, since the Rio Grande crosses Las Cruces and Albuquerque in New Mexico, that when you put your hand into the river, you can feel the force. Seemingly, it looks like it's not moving. It's very, slowly moving. But no, wow, you can feel the force of that. So consider that our students' language practices and how taking up and incorporating a translanguaging perspective in the classroom means bringing the corriente closer to the surface, making it visible and palpable, and then going with its flows in the classroom. So I will also be sharing with you in a couple of slides some videos of what that looks like. I know you viewed it with the young students there, but we'll see more specifically how teachers do that. But before that, I want to just end this section here with why take translanguaging perspective in classroom. So you can see here that this is the why of what we do, in particular with the work that we did with the translanguaging classroom. And so first of all is to support students as they engage with and comprehend complex content and text. And two, we want to provide opportunities for students to develop linguistic practices for academic context. Three is to make space for students' bilingualism and bilingual ways of knowing. That's very important, though, because you could see that in the student previous example. And then lastly, support bilingual students' social-emotional development and bilingual identities. And toward the end of my talk, I do have a video of a young lady that graduated from one of the dual language schools that I work with that really looks at that bilingual identity and who she is. So now let's move to the translanguaging as pedagogy. I talked about translanguaging is a shift in perspective, as I talked earlier on language. Well, it's also a shift in language pedagogy that moves away from a deficit-oriented thinking and aims to make visible and then leverage students' linguistic gifts that they bring. Lilia Bartolome often refers to our multilingual students as linguistic geniuses, and they are, because when you listen to them, you listen to their corriente, the sky's the limit. I just love going into classroom and be able to listen to them. And so, in the book, we introduce the term translanguaging pedagogy, and you can see there we have the stance, the design, and the shifts. And so to briefly kind of give you an orientation of what this is, so the stance, I'll just describe it the way I usually do with my teachers, is that the stance is your ideological, your belief, your philosophical way of approaching pedagogy. We all have that. We also sometimes emulate our few teachers that we look up to, or even the professors that we look up to. And so I think we all come from that. That then really springboards to the design. What are you going to design a classroom space, instruction and assessment, and how does that align and emerge from a translanguaging stance, which it does. Because oftentimes, drawing from that stance that you have about translanguaging will then let you see through that lens, if you will, for your design, and also the shifts. The shifts are those, I call them these aha moments when, I know if you're in English language development or in a bilingual education classroom, the students are just like, I need to say this. And, they're not thinking, am I saying it in English or Spanish? They just want to express it, and they say it. And you're like, whoa, wow, that's great. And so rather than me, I know as a former dual language teacher, I would be like, oh, estamos en hora de español. We're in Spanish time. Can you wait? I wish I knew what I knew back then, 20 years ago. Now, when I see teachers and work with teachers and coach them, I say, let them express themselves. Because I have actually seen students in dual language programs that when they tell them you need to wait because it's not English time and you're speaking in English, I have actually physically seen their heads drop down. So no, we don't want that, and I'm sure all of you here do not do that. We want to be able to leverage that for learning and move on, and so that's why this translanguaging pedagogy is very important for me, because we think of the stance, design, and the shifts that need to happen in the classroom. And so, now, in a general sense of what translanguaging stand, design, and shifts are, that I just mentioned to you. I want to show you a video of a teacher, so give you a little bit of context of who she is, that takes up a pedagogical approach in her highly linguistically 8th grade English language arts classroom in Brooklyn, New York. This video comes from the series featured on the website of the Project CUNY, New York State Initiative on Emergent Bilinguals, which is often referred to as the CUNY NICEP. I highly suggest that you look at it because it has great videos and a lot of downloadable translanguaging guides. Before taking so the thing is, what you will see here is that the teacher will be talking to the students and navigating, even though, and her name is Ms. Chapman Santiago, you'll notice her stance as you are viewing the video. How does she translate that stance into the design and shifts that I just mentioned to you? And how is Ms. Chapman Santiago's approach aligned with movement toward equity and social justice? So let's watch this, and I am going to, oops, hopefully if I go there, yeah, I did. He gave me a very great way of, sorry, and I think I forgot. Oh yeah, he told me this way too. Yep. There it is.
Currently, we're reading To Kill a Mockingbird, which is one of my favorite books, and I think it's a great book to teach this population of students. And one of my favorite quotes from this book is, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb in his skin and walk around in it. And I think that's what it's all about. I think as a middle school teacher, it's all about empathy.
Welcome back to Teaching Bilinguals, even if you're not one. I'm Sarah Vogel, a research assistant with the CUNY New York State Initiative on Emergent Bilinguals. Today I'm here at Ebbets Field Middle School, an exceptionally diverse school in Brooklyn, New York. On any given day, you can hear students speaking Haitian Creole, English, Spanish, Arabic, and 2 dialects of Fulani. Ms. Shireen Chapman Santiago is an 8th grade English teacher here. And she truly lives by that philosophy from To Kill a Mockingbird, that you have to know students well in order to teach them. But how can you truly crawl into your students' skin if you don't share their language practices? In this episode, we're gonna find out how she does it.
I think the quote really inspires me to dive deep and understand who the student is, and not just, a name on a roster, but who is that person, and build a relationship.
Let's get into Ms. Chapman Santiago's tips for building relationships with her bilingual students. Tip 1. Ms. Chapman Santiago is a keen observer of her students' expressions and behavior.
First and foremost, cues, body language. When you give them something and they're just like, they delve into it, or they kind of just like look around. So I always look at those things. I feel like I'm a mother first, right? So I'm very in tune to their emotions because they are teenagers and they're very dramatic. And so when they come in with that face, I'm not going to continue with the lesson. I'll direct the students to do something and I'll pull them out in the hall and have a conversation. If we don't speak the same language, I will pull out my phone, I'll type the question, give it to them, they'll respond, and I've literally had conversations like that and uncovered some really deep and personal things that actually helped me deal with the students accordingly.
Tip 2. When it comes to academics, Ms. Chapman Santiago provides opportunities for students to show what they know using home language practices. That way, she can see their strengths and their challenges.
The starting points vary from child to child. So even if you have 3 kids from Yemen, one may have had like some very advanced education, some may not because they're from the rural part. Those that are more proficient have an easier time making the transition from their language to English, while those maybe with formerly interrupted education may need more interventions. I don't know the languages of the room, but I look at their work and I can infer where they are and modify accordingly. If I gave her the prompt in Arabic and she only wrote 2 lines, then I start wondering, is she proficient in Arabic? And then I'll compare it to her counterpart who'll have a full page. And then I'm like, maybe I'll need to give her a little sentence starter or a little bit more background. In the beginning of the year, January, she started out with just 2 lines.
And then what do we see kind of later in the year with your supports? She's sort of writing
So she's writing more in Arabic, but it's half a page now. And then she's now attempting to write in English. And even though it's 2 lines, it's a victory for me. But today's entry was awesome. Where is it? It says, I wear my hijab. I don't know what that
With my
says.
Islamic
With my
clothes?
Islamic clothes, which makes me glamorous. And I was just like, yes, you are glamorous.
Tip 3. Based on her observations, Ms. Chapman Santiago creates scaffolds that draw on students' home language practices. Students who are literate in home languages benefit from translated copies of texts and prompts, like this exit slip. While students complete this assignment, they can talk to a partner using whatever language they'd like to ensure they understand what's being asked of them. In the end, they must answer the question in English so Ms. Chapman can see how they progress on specific language objectives.
Google Translate is always open. And then where I can, I have students also help. And I'll send things home to like older sisters or mom, parents for feedback, and it's just right. But it is a challenge, I'm not gonna lie. It's a lot of work, but it's necessary if you want everybody to succeed.
To recap, Ms. Chapman Santiago uses clues beyond language to help her understand her students. She makes careful inferences from students' home language practices, even if she doesn't always understand what they say or write. Ms. Chapman Santiago welcomes all kinds of language expression in her class and provides resources in home languages to students who she knows will benefit from them. Ms. Chapman Santiago demonstrates you can teach bilinguals even if you're not one. Join us next time.
So great, yeah. There's a great teacher. Wow. So I am going to give you, before I go into more examples of teachers taking up the translanguaging pedagogy in ways that align with social justice, I want to give you a few minutes. I'll give you about three minutes. Let's do 3 minutes for you to kind of your elbow partner there talk about how does Chapman Santiago's translanguaging pedagogy align with social justice and equity? And then secondly, how are you reflecting on your own pedagogy as you learn about translanguaging pedagogy? Now, when I ask you to come back, I'm gonna raise my hand, and then everybody raises their hand, just so that we can then come back. So I'm gonna time myself 3 minutes so I can get back to the keynote. But let's take a couple of minutes to just discuss these questions. So thank you. Rich conversation. I always wonder, should I do it or not? But it's such rich conversations going on already. So thank you for regrouping. I appreciate that. Lots to talk about, and now we'll have some Q&A at the end, so we can definitely continue the conversation. So I'm going to give you a little bit about Ms. Chapman Santiago's, how she explicitly, Ms. Chapman Santiago's approach to teaching to the translanguage and pedagogy that I just introduced, the stance. So her stance definitely includes building relationships, right? You can clearly see that with her bilingual students using kind of allowing the home language to be there. You could see her bulletin boards, her multilingual ecology is just everywhere. And her stance definitely informs her design. You can see that she gave the students opportunities to show what they know in their home language. She designed it, and then I'm sure you heard her say, she's like, I'm not going to lie to you, it's not easy. And I'm sure you all discuss it because it's not. As a former bilingual educator, I know it's not. I mean, the resources, and you always creating things and so forth. So you can see that that is something that she mentioned as well. Then you notice that her shifts, looking at her students' cues. I love when she said, you know, I look at their cues, because you could tell, you know, their head, are they smiling, are they not, do they look perplexed when you look out into your classroom? So I think that for me was really important when she said the cues, that we need to read into that. And then another thing that I really loved that she mentioned was the inferences, she inferred. Because I know I get the question a lot that, what do I do if I don't speak the language? And I'm like, well, you know, if you don't understand, you can then definitely, she uses Google Apps, you know, she tries to put the words in, or students that are bilingual and that she could ask, community members and so forth. And then also you can, just like those students in the first video, you start describing like, oh, what's this? And you're like, oh, you mean flat. Oh, okay, I know. And so that's how we communicate and are able to shift. And she did that very well. You could just notice that in her classroom. So again, Ms. Chapman Santiago's teaching is an example of translanguaging pedagogy at work, and she leverages her students' translanguaging for learning. And you can clearly see that in the example of the journaling at the end, you know, the progression of the students. So it was beautiful to see her translanguaging pedagogy, again, using the stance, design, and shifts that we have been talking about this morning. Now I'm going to give you more translanguaging in action. So how do different teachers, instructors across different contexts teach in ways that align with social justice and equity? And in our book, with Ophelia and Kate, we have three teachers in that book, Stephanie, Carla, and Justin. I will just address the two, Stephanie and Carla. So Stephanie, is a high school teacher, as you can see there, from New York City. And in this particular unit that she created, it was about environmentalists. One of the reasons why Stephanie did that, again, reading the students' cues or who they are, she noticed that, you know, she brought in a lot of literature, and in social studies, she also noticed that a lot of the historical figures, kind of the unsung heroes, were not represented, such as, you know, myself as a migrant, like Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and others. So she thought that she would bring in these Latinx people that represent the migrants, and also the work that some of her students come from construction, or that do, their parents or themselves as well. So in this a small group of students, they're discussing the issue of air pollution and its disproportionate impact on Latinx people. They looked at figures like the one on the map that you see there, looked at public service announcements about high rates of asthma in certain Latinx communities, and watched clips about activism such as People's Climate March. This part of the classroom conversation demonstrates the corriente that Stephanie has in her classroom. So I'm going to read to you the vignette, because I think most of you can read it, but back there it might not be visible. So in her classroom, this is what happened. So Eddie shared in English that his brother had really bad asthma and has had to go to the hospital several times. Luis jumped in saying, "Me too, my brother, él." In El Salvador, sensing that Luis having trouble continuing in English, Stephanie asked him to finish the sentence in Spanish. Luis continued in Spanish, explaining that his brother, who still lives in El Salvador, worked construction and that the dust from the work site gave him asthma attacks. Stephanie listened, and when Luis was finished, she asked another student in Luis's group, Mariana, to translate what Luis said. Though Mariana understands Spanish, she has told Stephanie that she feels more comfortable speaking English. However, she is a very competent translator, a skill for which, as Stephanie knows, she is often praised by her family. So not only does Stephanie's stance show up in her design, this is the unit, clearly of the environmentalist unit that she designed, aligned with the students' lives and aims to cultivate in them a critical consciousness of what was going on? Why is this so prevalent in certain populations? But in her shifts, which honor all students' contributions and communicate that all of their linguistic and meaning-making resources are welcome in her classroom. So you can clearly see how she's very responsive there and makes it relevant for the students. Another example, this actually comes from my dissertation work. Carla, a dual language teacher, what she did is, if you look at her stance, was really much rooted, this example about the assessments that are rooted in monoglossic thinking. Because even still now, we have assessments that are either English or language other than English. Very few assessments are looking at both together and how are they making meaning, how are they communicating, what content do they know. I know some are looking at this right now. Myself, with my own students, we use some formative assessments, drawing from the translanguaging classroom, mainly because as we design these assessments, that you look at them from different angles, as it's noted there. You can look at it from the teacher's perspective, the student's perspective, the families and community perspective, and then also even peer perspective. So that the richness of that you can get is more holistic and in a different way of seeing and listening to what your students are doing. So it's important to look at assessment, of course, and we often think of it as testing, but really what it is, we want to observe and see what our students are doing. So hopefully this example that Carla did, she was able to do that with her students, and myself benefit from it to be able to write about it and what she did in order for her to draw from her students' home language practice, and also in translingual ways that she was able to capture that in her classroom. So, more examples, taking up translanguaging in school communities. I think that's very important, though. How do we take it up in your school communities? And so how teachers take up these shifts in perspective and practice juntos. So juntos comes from the philosophy that we think that both languages and also community home languages go together. Remember that bidirectional bridge that I talked about earlier, that from home to school, school to home, it's also very applicable. So now I'm going to share some of the work that the CUNY NYSEP that I mentioned earlier. I highly suggest this website. You can definitely just look at the translanguaging guides, and it'll populate it to all the different guides that they have. But what I love about their inquiry-based project that they did was that they focused first, they created 2 non-negotiables, as you see there, that there must be a multilingual ecology for the whole school. And in the video with Chapman Santiago, you could see clearly that that was happening. You could see the wall was just full of examples of how you do that multilingual ecology. And then bilingualism must be viewed as a resource in education. So how do we leverage that bilingualism in our classrooms is very important. But what I definitely love about their project is they first started with administrators having a seminar about what bilingualism, translanguaging, how translanguaging shapes that bilingualism, biliteracy or multiliteracy in their schools. I think that's very important. That's why they had a lot of success, because the administrators and leaders understood what it was, and then they would assign each school a team to guide their development of a plan, as you see there, and they worked within EBLT, which is the Emergent Bilingual Leadership Team, to implement what the plan, and then they went back and evaluated and talked about what was going on here in your particular school. So I thought they were very strategic, and I can tell you that I know I use their resources for all my courses, whether it's second language acquisition or bilingual methods. They're our students really love them, and they're downloadable, and they're free and downloadable and free, something like that. So anyways, but the other thing is, you can see here that centering bilingual students by design, this is how they were able to work with the emergent bilingual leadership teams, the EBLT. You know, they looked at everything from school-based leadership group that they were gonna be working with them, and then they talked about the WHO, which are the administrators, coaches, a lot of their leaders that were there, and how often they did it bi-weekly. They often did it when, before, during, and school, and very consistent of the meetings that they would have. And so, therefore, that you could just see there. And they also created a resource for leaders. That's the one that's right there, planning resource packet. You can, again, that's available for you, so you can, if you want to work in your school community, you can definitely use it as a blueprint and adapt it as needed. My personal work that I've done is with participatory action research. And so what I call in Comunidad, a translanguaging study group in a large school district in the Southwest. I worked for 2 years. I was a biliteracy specialist there before moving into the university level. But what I did is I strategically, in year one, I looked at developing that knowledge of the teachers. And so we did use the Translanguaging Classroom book and other research to be able for them to understand what it was. We had rich dialogues. On Saturdays, we met for 2 years, every other week. And then we also had our district support us. So they did get a stipend, the teachers. But it was just great how the teachers were leveraging translanguaging in their classroom. And we studied it. That's a picture of one of the third grade teachers working there. And we were able to publish several publications with the teachers that I did. So it was great to see that outcome as well. In year two, I focused on implementation. And so the teachers, there was 20 in the beginning, and then we ended up with 12 just because of life and so forth. And so what I did, I would go and coach them, co-teach. I would co-plan, co-teach, and then also even in the moment, we would change things because we're like, oh, wow, this doesn't work. But I think that this is just a great opportunity to work and observe during language arts, whether it was in English or in Spanish. It was a dual language, and all the teachers were dual language teachers. And so lastly, one of the things, the examples that I have there is that one of the teachers actually took it upon herself to then have a professional learning at her school, very interdisciplinary. So she took her students and they talked about translanguaging in science, math, computer science, and so forth. And so they could learn about how, even though they don't speak their language, how they can support them using these very translingual approaches that they were learning in our study group. So now sorry, I don't know how that popped in there. So then now, one example of one of the teachers, and one of my favorite ones, again, that I co-authored a chapter with these teachers, was beautiful. So I'll give you some background. Jimena, this AP Spanish teacher, she worked while working at a large school district in the Southwest, as I mentioned. We discovered that in AP Spanish, only a handful of authors considered the canon literature drew from Chicano or Mexican-American authors, most of them from Latin America, Mexico, Spain. So she took it upon herself. She decided that in order to foster a bilingual identity, one of our whys, she would bring to live on the borderlands a Snow de product, which sings Soy Bilingüe. And so she brought these beautiful poems and texts, I should say. This is just an excerpt of them. They read them, and what she asked them to do was then to take 25 words of these, to live on the borderlands of Gloria and Saluda, and 25 words of Soy Bilingüe by Snow de Product. But then they had to integrate themselves into there in 50 words. So she put limits, but the students went beyond, as you will see. They were to create a poem about themselves, who they are. Yo soy, ¿quién soy yo was the question. And so you can see there that they're able to do this. You'll see right now how this particular student that you will view, she was able to then create this beautiful poem that she shared with at La Cosecha in 2019. And so it's a couple of minutes, so I will play that for you right now.
So sorry. Okay. So, me llamo Alexandra Jaques. Bienvenidos. Muchas gracias por esta oportunidad de compartir con ustedes algo muy importante para nosotros. We are seniors from Atrisco Heritage Academy. Today we will like to give you something to think about. At the beginning of the year, our AP Spanish literature teacher told us that before we embark on the literature of the course that was not really represented in our own culture, we need to center ourselves. So she assigned us to read To Live in the Borderlands by Gloria Anzaldúa and Soy Bilingüe by Snow the Product, to do a cross-linguistic and thematic analysis. Sounds hard, right? Well, it sure wasn't easy. But then she taught us how to read it into our own voices, which brought about this poem. Yo sé quién soy. ¿Quién soy yo? Who am I? Yo nací desde abajo y estoy creciendo con humildad. Believing I betrayed my Indian blood, my parents working hard to put me above. De pequeña ignoraba los consejos de mi madre, enojada. Y ahora me arrepiento, ¿por qué hice esas pendejadas? Trying to change my voice so my accent would come through. Trying to pronounce every syllable in Spanish so my family wouldn't disapprove. ¿Quién soy yo? Who am I? Yo nací desde abajo y estoy creciendo con humildad. Soy hispana, mexicana, mulata, mestiza, pero todo eso no me identifica. I'm a half-breed, Mexican-American, a woman who could speak both English and Spanish. Con el nopal en la frente me juzgaron a las gentes. Yo quiero vivir sin fronteras, porque con barreras no avanzan ni te recuperas. I know I'm amazing, and I know I'm fantastic. I know who the hell I am, so you need to look right past it. Don't judge me for my skin, judge me for my actions. ¿Quién soy yo? Who am I? Yo nací desde abajo y estoy creciendo con humildad. I am proud to say my name loud and clear. I know who I am. Yo soy Alexandra Jimena Jaques Domínguez Vázquez de Naya. Yo reconozco mi sangre ancestral y sé que es lo que me hace. Y ojalá que mi linaje mantenga su cultura y lenguaje. Tomo un poco de sufrimiento. Yo ahora vivo en la parla, en el espacio sin espacio. Tomo un poco de sufrimiento, tal vez una poca confusión, pero al fin llegué a la conclusión que mi sanación es más importante. ¿Quién soy yo? Who am I? Yo nací desde abajo y estoy creciendo con humildad. It's hard to see my family scream when they hear La Mira's coming and they just disappear. It's a fight to resist the beckonings of these strangers to finally give in and become the white bread that I've always found unsettling. But in the end, it doesn't matter to me, because I know who I am, and I know who I'll become, and I'll be dead before anyone changes me. ¿Quién soy yo? Who am I? Yo ya sé quién soy. I know who I am. Y con humildad, I'll spread my voice loud and clear and show who I am. Thank you.
Beautiful. So, thank you so much. Yes, she's wonderful. She just graduated from University of New Mexico and will be a bilingual teacher. Yay! So I'm so excited about that. So just to wrap up my talk this morning, some of the things that further is how do you model and share practices that promote translanguaging and celebrate bilingualism as a resource? So one of the things that I invite you all in June 12 and 13 in Las Cruces, New Mexico, we will have our third annual Translanguaging Institute. And I'm very happy to say that we have from our first institute, what we did is we had these wonderful scholars that came to present, and almost all of them contribute a chapter in this book, Cultivating the Pedagogy of Translanguage in K-12, Transformative Education. And it was well received in La Cosecha last week, and it was a great project to work with these translanguaging scholars that in a heartbeat they were able to support us. And all the royalties go to our Translanguaging Institute so that we can support, in particular, our graduate students. So this is just from last week. We presented, and our theme this year is Translanguaging Energies, Juntos, Corriente, and Wonder. And so the last thing is that I leave with you is that, so leverage your role, these takeaways that I leave with you is advocate for broader policy shifts that center and benefit bilingual students. Model and share practices that promote translanguaging and celebrate bilingualism as a resource. question policies and practices that are rooted in deficit framing of bilingual students. And then lastly, work with your college community to collaboratively evolve your own stances, designs, and shifts, as I have been in our local school districts. And then those are just some resources. I've mentioned the guides that are up at the top from the CUNY NICEP project, and then other books that are related to translanguaging. And so again, let's reframe the problem and offer an invitation to move definitely moving from a very monolingual, monocultural to a more multilingual, multicultural, and asset-oriented perspective for our students. So muchas gracias.
Thank you. We're going to break for our first session now. If you want to hear more about translanguaging, there's a part 2 at 11:15 right here in the ballroom. We do have record attendance this year, over 1,100. So please get to your sessions early. And if a session is full, please kindly choose a different session. So enjoy the conference. Thank you.